sometimes I get dreams and it messes up my plan. So I had a plan, and then I had a dream, so now I have a new plan. So I want to tell you about the dream. If you listen to and remember what I said about patterns and archetypes, you might find it interesting. Because I studied in the seminary in Boston, and so I had a dream while preparing the sermon that I was back at the seminary in Boston. The interesting thing, though, the seminary building ceased to exist. It was just a bunch of steel girders. I don't know if you've seen construction where they've just barely started, and it's just steel and light bulbs and stuff like that. So I was at the site of the construction, and I told the person, I don't know why I should know these things, but I told the person, the seminary was too old, and it had to be demolished. And so it needed to be rebuilt, and completely rebuilt. And so we're doing well, so let's go have a drink and celebrate. So that last part, that does sound like me. But a couple of things about the dream, in terms of reconstructing an old theological pattern, I was not in charge. The dream happened to me. I didn't think it up. I didn't make it up. I didn't design it. I'm not in charge of its timing or anything else. So it's like, wow, so something fundamental was going on. So I thought about the trigger for the dream. And I thought, okay, I am taking a class in the interpretation of the Bible, okay? Now, taught by a Jungian who is also a doctor. The thing about this is he didn't talk about theology or like anything to do. He talked about, when he talked about St. Paul, he talked about St. Paul went blind, he couldn't speak, he had some difficulty, he went blind for 3 days. He said something like, St. Paul's left frontal lobe must be on the fritz. And it's like, okay, so I could go to my theological library, which I no longer have, but if you go to any theological library, look up St. Paul, look for prefrontal lobe. Nope, you're not going to find it there. So what he did was he says, let's take theology and let's not talk about what the words were or the concepts like that. Let's talk about the theology as what is happening spontaneously within the person who is writing the text. I was like, okay. Now, even in the Catholic schools, no one has ever said that the Bible dropped out of the sky. It was written by a person at a particular time. I know there's oral traditions, there's translations. We don't have to worry about all that stuff today. Believe me, I had enough of that at school. But it offered a very unique perspective, is what is happening within a person when certain images appear spontaneously and autonomously. So the point is that, well, there's a pattern that takes place. And today, we're going to talk about that pattern. I'm just going to take a minute, talk amongst yourselves. Smoke them if you got them. Anyway, in the book of Daniel, the apocalypse, as we all kind of gather, it's like, okay, a dream about the end of the world. So let's take, in the book of Daniel, the apocalypse in the Old Testament. Okay, Daniel is a Jew, and the Jews had a deal with God. We'll follow the law, we'll worship you above all other gods, and then you will take care of us. So you're going to picture this as Daniel's life wrapped around the Jewish religion. So the laws in the Jewish religion, I looked it up, there was, in some versions, there was 614 laws, others say 635 laws. Anyway, a lot of laws. And he wraps his life around it. He lives the laws to the best he can. But what happens to Daniel? What happens to Daniel is he lives during the time when he has had this covenant with God, and God is supposed to take care of his country. His country is invaded and taken over by the Babylonians. And now Daniel is a prisoner of King Nebuchadnezzar, I think in Babylon or something like that. So Daniel has a self-image. This is how it's supposed to be. And then something comes along and smashes up against it. So the psychiatrist that I studied with on the internet says this is cognitive dissonance. Geez, I like that. That's a $10 word. But mostly you experience cognitive dissonance all the time when you say, what the hell happened? What is that? So the opposite of what he expected happened to him. And so what does he dream? He dreams that a monster is released, a monster that tramples, devours, and crushes his opponents and restores things back to where they're supposed to be. Okay, we could actually stop right here if you could get that. Somebody has a life, they built it on a certain principle, it's established, something happens that threatens the very existence of the life, and a spontaneous image appears, and going back to, never mind what he says, Daniel feels that his life is threatened, his very existence, all that he's lived for, all the meaning of his life is shattered. And so what you're likely to get is he is saying that God is angry and going to come and destroy and restore, which probably, if you look at the writer's psychology, it's an example of the writer, repressed anger exploding out because it is not the way he was brought up to believe. I have to write things down. I'm getting older now. I got to turn the page. Okay. Jesus comes. He says, you know, those 614 laws, somebody asked him, hey, what about those laws? He says, you know what, there's only two. Love God and love your neighbor. I say, well, and so his followers think, that's perfect. We don't have to follow this. If we follow the two laws, all the other ones will not be the same. It'll be totally different. And so there's an expectation amongst the Christians that things are going to be different. But let's read, I'm going to read from the 25th chapter of Matthew. I won't read it all. I'll read enough, though. Okay, so followers of Jesus are expecting this land of love. Okay, so they talk about the end of times. When the Son of Man comes in his glory, he will take his throne, and all nations will be assembled before him. He will place the sheep on his right hand and the goats on his left. Then the king will say, come for you who the Father has blessed. Come and be with me forever in love. For I was hungry, and you gave me food. I was thirsty, you gave me drink. I was a stranger, and you made me welcome. I was a stranger, and you made me welcome. I was naked, and you clothed me, sick, and you visited me, in prison, and you visited me. The virtuous will say, when did we do this? And the God will answer, whenever you did it to anybody, you did it for me. The people who did not visit the sick, feed the hungry, clothe the naked, or visit those in prison, he says, go away from me with my curse upon you to the eternal fire from the devil and his angels. Go away from me to an eternal fire with the devil and angels. Okay, many of you may have been wounded by apocalyptic talk from a church, a minister, a nun, whatever. You have to get beyond it, because today we want to get to the psychology of the writer. So the writer is expecting a land of love, does not find it, and says, listen, out of anger and frustration, the writer says, I think those people should burn in hell. You go to the Sistine Chapel, you know, there's a painted ceiling, but at the end of it, there's a giant thing of the Last Judgment, that God is separating the sheep from the goats. And it's like, well, that's interesting, but then the tour guide will say, well, that was written at the time of the Protestant Reformation, because the Catholic Church was saying, hey, I think you people are the goats, and you're going to go to hell. So what happens when the apocalyptic imagery takes place, the life expectancy of the person is shattered, and things are divided into two pieces. This may sound kind of familiar to you. Things get divided into two pieces. And then it's too bad we could do another sermon where the sheep are talking about those goats. They don't follow the rules. They break down the fences. They let it, and the goats are saying, "Hey, the sheep eat all the grass." Da, 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 da. Wartime begins. It has to do with the separating of things into the opposites, and then the opposites try to control one another by name calling. The opposites form like a warfare. Okay. After the New Testament, you had the Acts of the Apostles. Now, there's 4 Gospels. One was written by John, and then this book of Revelation, which is also written by John, or in the Johannine tradition. Again, we don't have to do all that. But John, the apostle, says God is love. God is love. Love lives in you. You live in. God will, if you love, God will live in you, and God will bring a new Jerusalem where everyone is blessed at all times. That he wraps his life around it. He gives up fishing or whatever his job was, follows Jesus, gives up everything, wraps his life around the gospel of love. And what happens? Jesus is killed in a cruel way, in the cruelest way, and is killed as a criminal. This is cognitive dissonance. Okay, what we expected, the opposite happened, and there's a shattering. So, in the next book he writes there's an angel coming is coming with fire and blood, and will hurl that upon the earth. And the saints will have every tear away, every tear wiped away. So there's the experience of the opposite becomes shattering. It's almost like the repressed anger and stuff explodes out of John and comes out fiery, but in a way that helps John from shattering. It keeps John from going crazy. Now, one of the things I try to talk about and emphasize is these things are spontaneous eruptions from the unconscious, like dreams, a lot of things that we do, like the fight or flight mechanism. These aren't rational things. These things happen to us. It's like there's an interior conflict going on. Okay, so I hope I'm sounding like a broken record by now, because I'm supposed to. Okay, so now we get to the difficult part. So you might think that, okay, that I decided months ago that I would give a sermon before the election, and that I had us all cooked up in one sleeve. I'm just not that clever. I was minding my own business months ago, and Vi called me and said, okay, we have a slot in November, will you do it? And I'm thinking, you know what, I don't have anything to say. Like, okay. And then I was like, well, you know, okay, I'll do it. And I was thinking, okay, I am taking the class with this guy who's a doctor, and I was like, well, maybe I could learn something in the class and share it with you in kind of a reasonable way. So, it is a danger for people who are rational to say, this apocalyptic thinking, this is no good. This gets us in trouble. This breaking things into opposites and then opposites fighting gets us in trouble. The answer is yes, it does. But it's a part of your psyche that you cannot cut off. When you go to the library, you probably will be thinking you're standing in the history section or the science section. You're not. You're standing closer to the poetry section and the poetry and psychological section. So you got to get your mind over there, get it away, because you cannot kill something off in the psyche without losing a part of yourself. And the most surprising thing about this, the months I spent preparing this, is that, okay, suddenly, wherever I look, I see this apocalyptic thinking. Now, I'm going to give you a nice, safe example. If you watch the movie Don't Look Up, okay, it's about, the movie is about, okay, people on Earth, the scientists see, like, there's a meteor coming, it's going to destroy the Earth, and they're all threatened, and nobody will listen to them. But see, that's apocalyptic thinking. It's a metaphor. Apocalypse is a metaphor for something that's going on. So if you watch Don't Look Up, and the asteroid hitting the Earth, it's obviously, this was put together by environmental scientists trying to tell people to change their attitude, because the apocalyptic thinking will tell you what's going on. Just like another example, people ask me, long before anybody heard of COVID, some friend of mine heard there was, hey, somebody is sick in China, should I care about that? And I was like, yes, you should care about that. And they were like, well, why? It's like, in 1971, there was a movie called The Andromeda Strain. And it's like, oh, this is a threat to our physical, biological life. And unchecked or unrecognized, it could destroy us all. One more, you know, there's a dozen movies about Terminators and iRobot. The machines are taking over. The machines are taking over our way of life and trying to destroy our life. This is creative, apocalyptic imagery trying to warn us. Now, you think, oh, that's not really... Okay, in front of Congress, the people who are designing artificial intelligence went to the Congress and said, please regulate us. Okay, so I remember this, 12 tobacco companies sitting there saying, no, why regulate? What's wrong with a cigarette? No problem. So if the people creating artificial intelligence say, please regulate us, hello? Then you have like all these science fiction things. I took a course in philosophy of science. My teacher says, watch science fiction. There are things you can learn there. So it can have a positive function. Okay, so now we get to what is difficult. So don't forget, I didn't plan this and I didn't mean to do it. But every day, 100 times a day, you will find apocalyptic language on the TV set. Yesterday, quote, unquote, there's a quote, if she's elected, World War III will break out and millions will die. Okay, if he's elected, it'll be the end of democracy as we know it. These are apocalyptic opposites, now in calling each other names, okay? And so my goal today is for you only to recognize what apocalyptic imagery is, to see how it is spontaneous, and then make your own decisions about it. Here's some warnings. Apocalyptic imagery, which talks about the end of the world, will almost always gravitate to a Messiah. Well, the Messiah could be on the left or the right, but messianic imagery will follow. And he's going to save us, she's going to save us, you got it. And this is how they're going to save us, and everything, if you just choose a side, everything is going to be okay. The most dangerous part, besides using apocalyptic imagery to manipulate people, is you have to be careful when it denigrates into scapegoating. When it reaches scapegoating, it has reached another form. Scapegoating is evil, pure and simple. I belong to a minority that was scapegoated. You probably all, at one time or another, belong to a minority that was scapegoated, and you need to call it out. So, I had another dream. We're going to conclude with that. This was a very odd dream, but I had a dream that there was this major conflict going on, and the good guys were heavily outnumbered. And so the protagonist in the dream goes to the land of the dead and speaks to the queen of the land of the dead and says, "You have to help or the good guys are going to lose." So, that dream's a little confusing, unless I give you the key. But the key is, what value have we had that we have lost? See, if you have a value in your consciousness, okay, that's great. But if we have a value that has decayed and gone down into your unconscious, it's like it was dead and buried. And the dream says we must find the value that was dead and buried, or we're going to lose. And that is what I leave you with, because that's a task for you. Thank you.